John. Well, it looks like it might be time to begin. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's discussion session hosted by Scottish Autism, and we're delighted to welcome representatives of the Flow Unlocked project, and we're going to be talking about that wonderful creative project this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome to this discussion Georgia Pavlopoulou, who is a psychologist at University College London. She's done some really interesting work around sleep and anxiety in autism and in autistic people, and has shared that work with us before now. And she's done some interesting research on the experience of siblings of people who have disabilities. And we're delighted to have her back today to share this creative project, Flow Unlocked. Also really pleased to welcome John Adams, who is an old friend of Scottish Autism, who's talked to us on several occasions about his creative work, about his lived experience as an autistic person and artist. His work spanned many projects involving public art and media. He spans different media in his work. His illustrious career as an artist, and has been a really constant champion of meaningful involvement in autism research by autistic people. So welcome back, John. And I should mention that the project that we're discussing today is undertaken as part of the group for relationships and neurodiversity, UCL, which Georgia heads up, and also Flow Observatorium, of which John is artistic director. And there were two reasons Scottish Autism were really keen to have John and Georgia here today. Firstly, because we wanted to learn more about this project, the themes that were discussed about experiences of lockdown, relationships, mental health, all things really pertinent to our experience as an organisation supporting people for the last year. But also, we've long been committed to try and undertake research work which is collaborative, participatory, move towards a kind of co-production model. And this project is a great example of that, and I'm sure we'll have lots of learning points for us. So we'll be talking both about the project and what's been produced, but also about the methods and the way in which that work's done. So really excited to talk about all of those things today. So perhaps we should start by just turning to Georgia, and perhaps you can tell us a bit about the Flow Unlocked project, Georgia.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It has been a project that has been a beautiful challenge for me as an academic researcher, getting into the creative mode, and also stepping back and sharing power and letting people with lived experience to lead me. So this project started with the idea of looking at relationships. During the pandemic, we have experienced this paradox. We need relationships. We need people more than ever. Relationships are the forgotten often foundation of mental health. At the same time, is that period that we need to exercise social distance. So there is that big paradox there. And when it comes, in my experience, being involved into autism projects, when we talk about mental functions, about attention, about mood and mental health, very often the research has a medicalized deficit focus. So we look at all of these in relation to deficits, in relation to not to the differences of autistic people, but in a concept of how different people, how autistic people are doing this differently, hence they don't have relationships, or hence they're having mental health issues. And we completely flip the narrative. We wanted to do something completely different. We assume that relationships are important. In order to have good physical and mental health, you need to be around people, places, objects that you feel good. And when we don't, these connections are crucial. And when we don't have connections, then our mental functions, our attention, our mood suffers. So we very much wanted to hear from autistic people, to work with them rather than on them or for them, how they enjoy connections with people, nature, objects, places, friends, sounds, family, because we do know that this kind of connections can help people have healthier and happier lives. So at the period of the pandemic, particularly, it was a period of lots of surveys. Everybody started working online, which meant that mostly you were asked and people used lots of questionnaires asking how anxious or how depressed or how lonely you might be. And there is a really good reason to look at loneliness, because the World Health Organization in 2019 declared an emergency. Loneliness kills as much as 15 cigarettes per day. People who feel lonely have cardiovascular diseases, more mental health problems. But we wanted to go beyond these questionnaires and the surveys that are made with items that are made by non-autistic people for non-autistic people. So we tried to think of ways to capture and record relationships within the project. And this is where we wanted to employ autistic authenticity and autistic creativity with the hope that these forms of expression will facilitate not only more authentic narratives that really represent autistic people, but also it might facilitate, during this difficult time for all of us, some meaningful connections. People have been unemployed for a while, people have been lonely or social isolated for a while. So I was hoping that the group itself could facilitate this human connection. So we didn't want to assume how autistic people connect before and during the pandemic. We wanted to find out. And I use the word assume because as a researcher, very often our work is driven by hypotheses and assumptions that we're making. And working with people with different minds, with neurodivergent people, it means that our assumptions are rarely the right assumptions. So the starting point is a really important one. To give you an example, in the beginning of the project, I was talking with Bryony Campbell, who is our filmmaker, and we were talking about how much we miss physical contact and how important it is for mental health. When we spoke with our co-creators, one of them is Benny Wheeler, and we thought about intimate relationships. He talked about his relationship as an East Londoner with a West London girl, and he spoke about the comfort that he felt from the physical distance, and that the distance meant nothing to him. Being situationally mute, having sensory differences, it meant that there was added beauty and comfort to the online contact with his girlfriend. So it completely shifted, the narrative of the rules that we have. Oh, it must feel like this, it might be like that. So very much the framework of the research is a frame that is honoring autistic people's experiences. And I think our work is touching upon quite a few important dimensions. Instead of having questionnaires or looking at traditional mental health issues, we look at mental health in relation to sense of belonging. In relation to the uniqueness of each autistic person being a different person with different identities. But I'm not going to say much more for now. I mentioned the film Distance is Nothing, and Benny's narrative is such an interesting narrative. If it's okay, we could watch this now.
The way they talk, you'd think the way I think and feel is wrong. The absence makes the art grow heavy. But distance is easy. Distance is easy. I cannot touch the sun, but her beams, blazing through space, seeping through skin, into my very bones. At night she is too far to see, but her rays shine far enough to reflect off the moon. She's constant. Our threads run from east to west, west to east. Strong sutures, knotted tight, secure. They weave through the vast space in between us like it is nothing, until it is nothing. It is nothing. How strange that others cannot bear to be apart. How fragile their bonds must be.
You got an idea of a narrative, and behind each piece of work that you will see, you just saw, and the work that John is going to present just now, there is lots of co-production. There is meetings, there is work made by filmmakers, music by John, movie edited by Bryony, poem by Ben. It has been a very collective thing, and we're quite proud of that. Over to John to present some bits and pieces of his work.
Thank you.
If I could just add in, John, before you start, I'm really sorry to interrupt. What I should have said at the beginning was that if people have questions for the panel, there's a Q&A section, which you're very welcome to add questions and thoughts in there, or add some thoughts into the chat. And I'll put those questions to John and Georgia at the end. I'm really sorry for interrupting you, John, but I want to encourage people to respond and comment on this wonderful work. So over to you, John. Apologies.
No, thank you. Questions are really good. Just a couple of slides just before I show you the Flow Unlocked work, because this is kind of what I used to do. So this was a project from Parliament Commission where I did the digital engagement project, making digital work. Next, please. This was a huge project I did where I actually wrote down and mapped 2 million minutes of my life, and it got me my diagnosis of autism, by the way. Next one, please. And this was a project that I did, chosen to show my work at a festival at the Royal Academy in 2019. And being synesthetic, I tend to take a chair around with me, which acts as a translator between me and the spaces that I photograph. And I've been using this photograph also to talk about the way that there are too many empty chairs where autistic people should be. So now onto the Flow Unlocked artwork, if I can have the first one. Okay, you know, as one of the Flow Unlocked artists, instead of doing my usual digital artwork or conceptual sound, I decided I'd take a risk and draw. You may think it's strange for an artist who spent 25 years drawing books to say drawing is risky, probably traumatic. You know, I started drawing at school to be good at something and camouflage or distract from my deficits and differences that were frequently pointed out to me, especially spelling, writing, my awkward social ability. It completely backfired when I had a picture torn up in front of the class as I'd spelt my name wrong and told I'd never be anything, so I stopped drawing. When I moved away from drawing to contemporary socially engaged conceptual artwork, I reused the skills digitally, but at times my responsive drawing, aided by my synesthesia rather than illustrating figuratively, but always transforming words, experience, and even time into birds or fantastic creatures. So for Flow Unlocked, during our meetings, I drew synesthetic notes, and then the risk taken was creating multiple figurative narratives and scenarios based on those words and themes and conversations we all had, but continuing in a bird metaphor, which kind of breaks an autism stereotype for a start, and we need to break autism stereotypes and myths. So this one is called the Imposter Syndrome. You know, we autistic people have often been required to mask our differences. We are constantly told the way we think is wrong, or we're simply born lesser or broken. This fundamentally affects our self-confidence, esteem, ongoing image of ourselves, our mental health. Often we are told we should have been born someone or something else. No wonder autistic people feel they don't belong or are imposters. Often, unfortunately, it feels like expect nothing, so don't ask for anything, or we do too much, overcompensating, yet feel we've done nothing. Even when we succeed, we feel we don't deserve it and have fooled everyone and fear being found out. So unfortunately, some outsiders try to gain our confidence and trust by disguising their true intentions to exploit, betray, and ultimately harm us. And by the way, this picture was chosen for the International Pandemic Art Archives at Berkeley in California last year. You know, trust is really important for autistic people. Next one, please. So this is called The Collector, and it was actually inspired by one of our participants. So one of my intense interests, and I say intense interests, not special interests, is collecting. And during the abuse at school, I lost myself in the natural world and started collecting objects that seemed to speak to me. That's why I trained as a paleontologist and not as an artist. This love is shared by many autistic people, and we collect objects, words, stories, stars, images to create museums in our minds and in our homes. I turned my collecting into a career, something not often allowed by those who demand to overwrite our narratives and directions as children. As well as collecting, there's the need to share our collections, as we did during the Flow Unlocked sessions, much to all our mutual delight. Next, please. So this is Stories Around the Hearth. I feel sharing our stories and experiences not only with wider society, but with peers is vital. We are often isolated or found as disparate clusters, hidden and battered, but to hear others exist who share both our seemingly positive and negative experiences is autistic joy. It helps our well-being, it helps our belonging. This was one of the first drawn to illustrate our sharing. We were becoming a team. We were trusting, which is so important for autistic people. We were becoming a temporary tribe. And the last one, please. So this was where the Flow Unlocked birds, the COVID corvids, come from. And they were an attempt to draw the mental health conditions that I have, the PTSD, just to get it out there and talk about it, really. You know, making artwork doesn't act as a cure, but you can connect with the artwork to bring out very difficult subjects, as well as both the joy. And, you know, we need this on our path to recovery. Mental health is so important, especially for autistic people, because we don't often get the appropriate help or support when our mental health fails. I think there's one more picture, isn't there? Yeah. This is called A Collection to Confound the Researchers. Now, I break a lot of rules here. This came from some conversations about assumptions. George has already talked about assumptions. The way we autistic people are seen and treated by some autism researchers, and the experimentation they do to prove we need fixing and are innately broken. Yes, the inevitable faux autistic mice rearing their heads and burying their marbles, but the corvids are digging them up to confound the research. You know, I like marbles. I even dared to line them up as a child, and thank goodness no one noticed, but I kept them from harm. You know, to close this series of images, I feel we need to tell our stories in ways and confound the shifty autism research often imposed and designed to prove an autism researcher or funder's assumptions or ideological and financial self-interests. You know, we are people. We are innately human. And I hope Flow Unlocked reinforces that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing that artwork and that intensely personal insight into the work, John. I'm really struck by the kind of metaphors that we find in this work, whether it's the thread in the film, whether it's the crows or corvids, I should say, the COVID corvids, the mask. Just really striking, I think, and I'm kind of interested to learn, were those kind of shared metaphors, were those ones you talked about as a group? Did you each bring your own personal symbolism into the group? I'd just be interested to hear about how you worked with these metaphors.
Well, the metaphors came naturally. The metaphors came from the conversations. And I'm talking about metaphors as an autistic person. I'll have my diagnosis revoked soon, because that's one of the big autistic stereotypes, isn't it? That we don't understand. You know, we don't understand this, we don't understand that. We can't make connections. We can't, you know, produce metaphor. Why not? We understand, you know, some people may not be able to, but some of us can. And it's that blanket stereotype and myth that we don't understand irony, we don't have empathy, we don't. And when you get a group of autistic people together, you know, we communicate. The research has shown that you put a group of autistic people in a room, our communication's fine. It could be silent, it could be a conversation, but we can talk, we can understand each other. It's when we get non-autistic people involved that sometimes things go downhill, because they bring their view of the world through their eyes, and it's not ours. They assume it is ours because that's what they're used to. But, you know, autistic people are very grown up in the way they look at the world. And, you know, the research that we needs to amplify this knowledge exchange between autistic people and non-autistic people. We don't want to self-silo. We want to use the, you know, when a random researcher runs a survey or a questionnaire, how do you join with it? How do you connect with it? But when you do creativity and you do artwork and you ask people, what do you want? What have you got to say? What's your opinion? These connections start clicking, the metaphors start growing, and it evolves into something. But it's that space, that safe space, that trusting space. And one of the things I was going to say later, I'll just put very briefly now, was that trust is so important. You know, a lot of autistic people have had their fingers so badly burnt, me included, that it, you know, to have an autistic person leading the creativity with other autistic people just provides that theme and that layer that runs through the whole thing of authenticity and understanding. That, you know, you can say what you want, and people, when you ask people to be creative, to write the poetry or to draw or to describe, people connect with it more than just a question, just a survey, tick this box. No, I want to draw the box and I want to write the question, and then I will tick it.
Georgia, it sounds like you, thank you for that, John. It sounds like you wanted to add something there, Georgia.
Yes, just to amplify, I think that John mentioned two really important things. For me, the first part is very important in relation to trust and to share the roles. It was so interesting to take decisions about Our autistic people are consultants, our participants, our co-creators, and sharing fully power was the best model. And this type of mutuality across different neurotypes, it doesn't come easy. It does come with pains, with misunderstandings. And this is why being very open, making things accessible, being very transparent really helps. When you sign up for truly participatory work, it means that you need to be ready to be challenged. And I was challenged quite a few times. And I think it's impossible to stay in your comfort zone and do what you were doing, thinking that this is truly participatory work. John mentioned as well about the methods. I think it's so important to facilitate, not just to allow, but to emancipate and to facilitate interaction for people to talk about things that really matter to them. So when it came to mental health and pandemic, people didn't want to talk about anxiety and depression, wanted to talk about things that they miss, but as well about freedoms and joys during that period that came up unexpectedly. So when it came to methods, for example, I had a little bit of my hands into photo voice and using photography as a way to elicit people's views. And I thought, I'm so creative, I've done that. When I proposed that to people, they were not that excited. In fact, they were not excited at all. And they proposed so many different other methodologies. And I'm like, you know, as a researcher, you do go through that phase. You say, do I really go with what they say? And I think that's always the best option, to listen to people and go with what they say. And in fact, when we were piloting different methods, because it's important people to talk about things that matter to them in ways that also matter to them. And in fact, they asked me to pilot for my project and how I see my role in the project through photography. And I realized what a difficult, I had two very difficult weeks. And I realized what I have been asking my participants is not that easy or fun as I was assuming. So it was interesting. What is interesting is in participatory research, there is some fluidity in roles that is helping everybody to develop more perspective around the tasks.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I remember some work we did early on about voice and participation and recognizing different voices and different media for supporting people to express themselves. And this expands it to a really creative level, I think. And I can feel a lot of resonances with that, different media, different, you know, whether it's film, music, drawing, whatever it might be. It's fantastic. Thank you. So just to turn us back to this question of metaphors, because, you know, I'm struck by the name of the project, you know, Flow Unlocked, and we've got a sense of flow in the way that John was talking about his creative process. But I wonder if perhaps the people who are less familiar with the sort of maybe the psychological concept of flow and how you played with that term and that metaphor in this project and how it became so central. Can you tell us a bit about that? What flow meant to you and how the project came to be called Flow Unlocked? Because I'd like to know more about that.
Thank you. So Bryony Campbell, our filmmaker, she brought up the idea of working around Regent's Canal and Lee River as a geographical focal point for the project. We really wanted, through funding from UCL Culture, we really wanted to involve East Londoners. It's a multicultural community, traditionally very much excluded from research, that the voices are quite marginalized. So it was very important for us to go to the other side of London. So we saw the rivers and the canals as a metaphorical flowing artery of that East London neighborhood that is continuously changing. And then this is where me and John, we found an inspiring connection to the positive psychological theory of the flow state. The theory of flow state is popular amongst autistic thinkers as it resonates with the ability of autistic people to have a very monotropic, to have extended focus and to hyper-focus on specific areas of intense interest. And when that happens, there is that feeling, this optimal experience is cultivating very positive feelings, calming feelings for autistic people. So we were very much interested as well. During the pandemic, there was an interruption of the flow of what was called normal life. There was an interruption of the flow of autistic people's relationships. There were new rules introduced. There were new changes and routines. So the idea of flow versus lockdown echoed a lot the geography of East London's waterways as well. And played a bit with that idea. I don't know if John would like to add anything to that.
Yes, just a little bit. You know, obviously I work with a charity called Flow Observatory, and flow, as an artist, flow is really important. I remember when I was doing book illustration, I would get so taken by what I was doing that, you know, everything else falls away. And, you know, that's really important. And it's not just about concentrating really hard. You know, I actually find concentrating very hard myself. You know, when I showed my really complicated drawings I used to do for books, people say, oh, you must have a lot of patience. No. But we can get so absorbed in things that hours pass, we forget to eat, you know, but it's that important thing is that everything else falls away. Now, you know, sometimes, you know, water is great. You know, I've loved water since a child. It can be both a pleasure and a pain to autistic people, because I know of a lot of other autistic people who love water, and unfortunately it can be quite tragic too, especially for children. But you know, it's that's the, you know, again, we're talking about metaphors, aren't we? I love just sitting on a beach on the shingle watching the tide, because it's that boundary between the land and the sea, and it's, if you look at all the myths and traditionalism about, you know, passing over things and boundaries and that, and autistic people are faced with boundaries every day, and we have to have these escapes, let's say, and interests, and the flow just seemed really important. You know, we built our cities around, you know, rivers and arteries and connections, and it just speaks loudly to you. And I did actually have a connection with the East End, because that's where my gran came from and the family before then. So, you know, my ancestry kind of flowed back too, which is kind of good.
Thanks so much. I think those thinking about flow is really important to those of us that support people in services. How can we encourage people to engage in activities where they feel that sense of well-being and flow and intense connection? And I suppose another reflection I've found in doing things like dance and singing and drama is flow can be quite collective, can't it? You know, it's not just an individually focused thing. It can be quite a connecting element as well, and it sounds like there's some of that in this project too.
There were moments of intense connection. I guess what the arts did, it was in many ways liberating. From my perspective, as coming into the project as a researcher, I found a safe space outside the tyranny, what I call, of the quantitative, of the numbers, of the surveys. It was also a space where people could talk about things that matter and things that really hurt. There are so many other levels of othering. There are so many levels that we need to understand when we talk about relationships and mental health in relation to the societal deficits. Many people spoke about, through poems, for example, spoke about how they have been marginalized by their own family members due to their diagnosis. They spoke about how these family members that have marginalized them are probably, according to the autistic people's idea, they are probably as well on the spectrum, but they have been masking all of their lives. Lots of pain, lots of difficult stuff came up. And that flow of the conversation really brought us together, really connected us. For people, that sense of, I'm not the only one, that's one of the nice things in the group. It's not just me. Really private stuff that become a shared experience. We have been sharing that momentum, can be very, very powerful. Again, really good for our mental health. And then there has been this notion for me that clinical people work on their own with their gangs anyway, and then researchers work with their people, and autistic people have their own supportive groups, and we all sit beside each other, and why don't we do that more often? Why don't we work more together? There are so many benefits. It's a complete win-win. And again, when it comes to that feeling of mutuality and the flow of the conversations, the flow of the artistic flow that came in different mediums. Some people wanted to write proses, poems. John used sounds and drawings. Other people were non-speaking, they preferred to chat. You know, it does come again with pains. For me, it was very important to check in on how much or little I occupy the space, on how much accessible or not is what we're offering. There is a constant good reason to be worried as a researcher, in a sense of how collaborative, how accessible, how transparent what is happening is.
Thank you. That's a really important reflection, I think, for those of us that are researchers to think about. I wonder if it's now time to turn to another piece of work that came out of the project, because I know we have another short film to show. So I wonder if we should take a pause in the conversation and have a look at that.
Is it safe, she murmurs, floating orange, suspended neither out nor in, yet resting beneath a silvered surface of hasty scribbled ripples. Alone, waiting to sink, to desire the freedom to become lost to view in those dark, silt-filled waters. Is it safe, she murmurs, for me to move on tides, not breeze, masked in nature's disruptive camouflage, yet still seen, dazzling at depths, shallower than any comment received when spotted or found out of place, swimming somnolent and self-aware. Is it safe, she murmurs, for you to look upon this Medusa and dream of better days, spent swimming, naked, without any stone forming in your hearts, birthed by weighty words, remaining alert, ready to drown all who dare hold and question them in a single supine moment? Is it safe, she murmurs, for me to float out of existence, seeking favoured rest of 1,000 years, left to meditate and listen to time tick-turn, sinking with the sun dancing across my back? Reminded in flight I fight to hastily cover myself with shells and spoons, a selfless carapace to keep me warm in any future's winter's blight. Is it safe, she murmurs, for a last time, as any record is erased by finger-borne superstitions, leaving only the memory, discarded, fragged in noughts and ones, a reminder of something once lost and never seen, abandoned to rest in an imaginary cryptozoological zoo.
Well, thanks again for sharing that very arresting piece. It feels almost impossible to ask in words about such a multimedia piece. I don't know, I just got such that sort of double-edged feeling about the water there, John, the danger and the flow and all of those things, you know. is there anything you'd like to say about that piece and what you were looking to express in it that you haven't already said?
We've talked about how we did the project. We worked with, for me, there was no distinction between me as an artist, Georgia as a researcher, Bryony as an artist, and our participants. We were in this together. Georgia's spoken about the pain that came out at certain times, but we held each other. Maybe not physically, but certainly figuratively and mentally. And you have a group of people and each one holds the person in front. You're going to form a circle and everybody's going to be standing and supported. And we worked in a very iterative way. So I didn't know I was going to write that until I saw Bryony's picture of the bag floating in the river, and the words just, flowed, came. And, there's that myth that we need to destroy, that autistic people don't care about our environment. We don't care about others. We don't have, why should an autistic person have a relationship? They've got no empathy. It's impossible for them. This stuff just needs stamping out and disproving, because all researchers seem to do is want to prove their hypothesis. And even today, a new piece of research out that we don't care about the environment. Nonsense. I was going to say something ruder then, but these myths and legends that are applied to us and overlay our humanity and disguise us to and portrayed as deficits. This needs to change. This really needs to change. And whether we take we go into the waters and are born again, there's so many metaphors there. It needs to happen, because autistic people need, and we need that sense of belonging, which is paramount for our mental health. If we don't feel we belong, we leave. And we all know, the research on autistic people leaving is dire. And that needs to change, because we have a place.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
For many of us who, for many of us who are connected with autistic people, either in our families or in our friends or in such collective creative groups, we do see a lot, again, this paradox, as John said. On the one side, when you look at neuroscience and statistics and some quite medical models of representation, people are at risk, people don't understand, people don't feel, are not good enough. And on the other side, you meet autistic people. And the one thing I've learned with Flow Unlocked, I was already familiar with double empathy model, the work of Damian Milton, and the many friends and family members around me. But it really came again really, really strongly in this group is the unique, sensitive, and intense ways that autistic people connect with each other. And I think this is very much misunderstood. When we started the project, one of our co-creators, Danny, she said, can I talk about how much I love my friends, how much I want to be with them, to the point that I don't know how not to be with them. So it's these intense ways. People also spoke about their focused interests. And how much they personified stones or other objects or animals, and the feel-good factor that this is created. So I think there is something, as John said, about shifting the narrative about how we conceptualize autistic people, for one, and for two, how we understand mental health in autism. To me, it's impossible not to look at the social determinants of mental health and the lack of belonging and the lack of understanding. And the only way to shift that narrative is to emancipate and to put in the front line autistic people themselves.
Thanks, Georgia. Yes, indeed. It's interesting. We'd thought about dividing this talk in between, the project and then talking about the methods, but in fact you can't separate them. And so we've been talking all the way through about the collaborative, co-productive nature. We can't separate these things, it seems, from the work that came out of it and the way in which the work was achieved. And it's turning to the questions that we've got, and I think a lot of them relate to these issues. So I think we may go straight to the questions really to continue, because I think they will help help along our thinking about how we create the safe spaces that John was talking about, how we co-produce, how we make those spaces to hold each other, as John said. I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about it. And I'm struck by one question we've got. Someone said, "Can you tell us about how co-production worked at the data analysis level?" Is it right to talk about data in a project like this? Was there a process of analysis or meta, sort of creating a meta narrative about what you produced? Perhaps you could reflect on that a little bit for us.
We had so many discussions around, are we going to do a knowledge exchange program? Are we going to do a research program? Is it autoethnography? It's bits of everything. With the funding and the time that we had this year, we decided to make this a knowledge exchange program. We are in the process of writing the protocols that we have used to use them in both research. We're hoping for new funding to come and knowledge exchange. Again, in participatory research, and again, is a more of a mindset than methods, and it's a very fluid concept in my mind. But the way I have it at the minute, working with our co-creators, I can't separate the community engagement from the research process. I think we have piloted. We're in a very good place that we have piloted our methods. And indeed, we got data, we got narratives that we view them under the 8 dimensions of the life world framework and experience sensitive framework. So much of the stories fit under the sense of belonging, the sense of uniqueness, the sense of place, the embodiment of ability or disability. And at that stage, we're writing the methods, how we divided our workshops, the different areas of relationships we looked at, the ways that we try to be transparent, the ways that we address power differences, and constant cycles of reflection. So we're in a process of writing up this. If anybody's interested to get into the creative mode, Flow Unlocked, we are in a good position to offer consultations or support. So at that stage, the data are going to stay raw with autistic people's comments and interpretations. And we're hoping, we're writing a book proposal for an open access book, because part of being participatory, part of involving the community is also the open access. Otherwise, I'm just going to write it for my academic friends and people who can have access to pay. So we're hoping that all this is going to be in an open access book at some point. It does take time. This work is very messy, very creative, and protocols are made from scratch every time you have new people have new needs. There's that duty of care as well, to take care of each other, especially when we talk about relationships and mental health. So protocols need to be around that. But if I could say the key principles that are guiding our methodology is respect, get attuned to each other instead of assuming, and accept the challenge of co-creation by creating something new together. So when I first met Bryony and John, I had drafted something from my previous projects. It was never used. I got feedback from people that were not interested. With Bryony and John, we drafted something, and when we met the other 5 autistic people, they had tons of ideas and we modified it to the point that you could hardly recognize it. But that means, again, that you need to be open, flexible, and to trust people. And it comes from the ideological position, I guess, that local people in their local communities, in our case, autistic East Londoners, are in the best position to decide about how we will involve other East Londoners and academic community into autism and relationships.
Thank you for that reflection. John, you may have some things to add to that. I wanted to add to the mix an interesting question we've had in. John, you and I were involved in a project a few years ago about trying to promote greater meaningful participation and inclusion in research. So I thought this might be useful thing to reflect on. Someone's asked, what advice would you give to PhD students about using co-production? The ethical approval process seems more difficult when methods aren't certain at the start of the project, when you have more of an open-ended approach. Is true co-production a realistic goal when you're at the start of your research career?
I love the question.
Yeah.
It's a pertinent one, isn't it?
I think for PhD students and potentially their supervisors, is going to be, mostly for the supervisors, is a nightmare. In my experience, working with the Greek community, autistic and non-autistic siblings, I had to constantly change my ethics because, and that's the problem you have as well with funding. People are asking you to pre-design everything, to have everything ready in order to pass different committees. In my experience, when I was doing my PhD, I asked autistic siblings to do the methods that non-autistic siblings did. But autistic children came up and said, oh, we have used videos. I'm like, I don't have ethics for that. What have you done? Well, we thought that this is best capturing, you know, our ideas and our feelings. So you really need, when I said to accept the challenge, I really meant it. I think it does take a lot of time for PhD students. Maybe they can have smaller scale projects, more idiosyncratic. Trying to make it realistic is always a good thing to check so that nobody gets disappointed. So how it's sensitive enough and realistic, again, I would go back to the community. They have the answers. I always find answers from my collaborators on that.
John, did you have any reflections on these questions?
Ethics is a really interesting thing. I was artist in resident. I was welcome artist in resident at the Autism Research Centre. And it wasn't just about me getting some fabulous stuff to make some fabulous artwork about. One of the main priorities was that autism researchers could meet, an autistic person who just happened to be an artist, outside of the ethical structure. So they met me as a person, not as a subject or a patient. And they could ask me all the things that they could never ask me if they were interviewing me or observing me or anything. So, you know, what you had for breakfast, John? What do you like for this? You know, they met an autistic person. So many autism researchers don't meet autistic people. And, you know, co-production is not about having your token autistic person with you or alt-washing your research because an autistic person is present. It's about handing over some, if not all, of the power to that autistic person to say, okay, well, look, here we go. How are we going to do this? How are we going to make it safe for autistic people? So much autism research is about how to cure us, how to get rid of us, how to sort us out because we're obviously broken. You know, it doesn't focus on the things that we need. And that's where artwork comes in. I think all autism research project should have an artist in resident because we can say the things that they can't. An autistic artist in resident. And it needs to work iteratively too, because if I make something, the researchers see it, they change the research bit. But George is right. The funding restrictions, you know, are so tight from the funders, and you know they're normally there to set and suit the ideology or financial self-interest of the funders. You know, I've spoken to a lot of PhD autism researchers. They don't want to research what they've been given. They want to do something else that's more relevant to the community and more co-production. And the co-production needs to start with the funders. Doesn't need to start with the PhD student or their supervisor or the department or whatever. It needs to start before that. So, hey, we need to research this. How can we fund it? Who will agree to funding that? And it needs to be led, supervised, and you know, by autistic people. One very quick thing, if you wanted to know what it was like to go and stand on that volcano in Iceland, you'd ask someone who'd actually been and stood on the volcano in Iceland. You wouldn't ask their GP or their parents or someone who'd seen it on the telly. So go to the source, make it authentic, listen and act. No alt-washing.
Thanks, John. Spoken loud and clear. And I think I have some sympathy for the question, because I think, as John has said, the system is not conducive always co-productive research. And I think those of us that are in a position to do so need to keep campaigning to change the way that funding structures work, the way that research is allocated. So often the research funding system is competitive rather than collaborative. That definitely needs to change. We find ourselves up against it all the time. So I absolutely have sympathy what I've heard, both the question from the student and from what John said. So going on to the Q&A, I've just noticed that John Atkinson, who's left some lovely comments, by the way, in the comments section, has asked if this is recorded. Yes, John, it is going to be recorded, and we're going to put it up on the Scottish Autism website. So please do feel free to come back and kind of process it at a pace which works for you. I agree, there's a lot to take on. I've just got a really long comment and question here from Gordon Barlow, who's really reflected on our discussion about flow, which I think is really interesting. So Gordon says that often states of flow can be negatively characterized as obsessions and unusual focuses, an aspect of character that innately disadvantages an individual. Although that's only one side of the equation, and it seems to me the key strength of the project is to present an insider's perspective, showing that there are many ways of seeing these matters. For instance, it was mentioned that the benefits of being in the flow state can be a mental health aid. Do you agree that the inclusive nature of your project has been key to communicating the other side? In short, that it cuts both ways. So that's the question to you, John.
Very, very quickly, often, as a child, I was terminally curious. I wanted to know what was above me, what was below me, what was around me. I soon learned that just asking questions of people who didn't know, and I had to read it, I had to learn it. But, luckily I turned, if I wanted to go fossil hunting, I wanted to find fossils, I wanted to do this. I went to all states of the tide and in darkness with a torch. People said I was obsessed. I just wanted to do it properly. And what's the difference between calling an 11-year-old who loves paleontology and would do anything to get, you're obsessed, but then when you're 25 and you're stuck in the back of a research room, you're a researcher and you're doing it properly. There's no difference. And so many times the autistic people's interests were deliberately disregarded. Well, you can't turn that into a career. Why the hell can't you turn that into a career? 20, 30 years ago, it was really frowned on. That needs to change. And if you're not allowed to do the things you love and are passionate about, it leads to poor mental health. It has to. I don't belong because my interest is not shared. I can't share it. I'm really passionate. You can't switch off your interest. There isn't a button that says nobody else is interested, so I'm going to switch it off. Or I've been told not to be so keen. As a 14-year-old, when that's kind of keeping you alive because of all the other issues, and you're told to stop, that does immeasurable damage, and it actually needs to stop.
Thanks, John. Thank you. And which is why it's so inspiring to think about spaces where that flow can flow. I don't know if that's the right verb, but it's been really inspiring to hear about this project. We're coming up to 1 o'clock, so I could talk to you all day, both of you, and I'm sure most of us could listen to you all day, but it's been a really inspiring project to hear about and learn from. I hope that our dialogue can continue. And I just want to acknowledge in the comments Hannah's comment that she found the work powerful and moving, and thanks you both for sharing it. John, who said one side doesn't fit all, and I think that really comes across in this project, different voices, the different media that we used. And also, John's comment that autistic people have been shown in research supposedly as being uncaring about the environment. Una just mentions Greta Thunberg and Chris Packham, which I think certainly figures that many of us will relate to as being completely the opposite of that stereotype. And thank you for bringing those forward. So thanks very much, both of you. I think we should also acknowledge all the other collaborators in the project who produced that work, and if people want to learn more about them and the work, please do visit the Flow Unlocked website. If you want to tweet about today's event, please hashtag Flow Unlocked, share it with others who may then follow up, watch this video, visit the project website. And I'll just ask John and Georgia if they have any final comments or thoughts before we say goodbye. John.
Never surrender.
Georgia.
Thank you so much for offering that space. Scottish Autism, many more organizations, unfortunately not all, but many more, really promote that sense of togetherness in the community, learning from each other. The is really learning from each other, holding each other's hands. Mutuality does come with difficulties, but if we are together, we overcome that, and the result is good friendships, good projects, and flipping that deficit narrative. Thank you.
Thank you both. I always learn from listening to both of you, and thanks again for sharing your project today and for giving us your time. Thank you to everyone that's joined in on the chat and the Q&A today, and let the conversation continue. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye. Good afternoon.